Welcome. Hey there, friends. It's Teresa, and I am so glad to be back with you. I have been looking forward to being back in my office, back home again, so I could record this podcast. So thank you. Thank you so much for being on this journey with me together around the things that really matter. I have been gone for almost 16 days. I've gone from Illinois to Florida to Georgia, back to Illinois. And in those 16 days, I have had, to be honest, some life-changing experiences. Now, I planned this trip probably over a year ago. I planned this particular trip in January around a mastermind event that I'm a part of, and I'll say more about that in just a minute. And then I also planned, because part of my, one of my areas of focus is travel and recreation. In the process that we have, I use something called areas of focus, and one of mine is travel and recreation. And so I had specifically designed this trip to be in Florida for about 10 to 12 days and then come up to Georgia and a place in North Georgia that I love to go to and spend that time with family. And it was just a very purposeful trip. But I had no idea when I left 16 days ago that it would have so many life-changing events. And so today I'm going to just share one of them. And if you saw the title of this podcast, it's actually about companionship and being a companion on the journey, and just my tribute to one of my companions, one of my mentors, Dan Miller. And so before we get into that conversation, though, and I share some of the backstory of that, I want to share something very personal that I've discovered about myself and kind of the legacy I want to leave behind that I've gotten to over the past 2 weeks. But before I go there with the story and all those aha moments, I want to invite you to a free resource that I really do want you to grab if you haven't done this before. And it's a resource that we have about your top 5 needs and your top 5 values. And you can find that at thereallifeprocess.com, needs and values, all ran together, needs and values. We'll have the link in the show notes. But the reason I want you to grab this is because knowing your values can make a difference in the legacy that you want to leave. It can make a difference in how you might companion someone else on the journey. So grab that download. That's one of the things that I think will be really helpful as you reflect and you personally look at some of those things. So thanks for being with me, on the podcast today as we do life together, as we come around the things that matter to live from rest, not rush. I come as a follower of Jesus, as someone who's doing life day in and day out, just like you are, and connecting to not only how I grow spiritually and how I grow personally and how I grow in my business. All of those things belong. And that's some of the conversation that I want to have with you here today. So let's dive in. I want to start by giving you a little bit of backstory before I actually get into talking about my mentor and my friend, Dan Miller. And I want to set up a little bit of why. Why did this person become so important? But before I even go into that story, let me share with you that I have been a part of Mastermind with Dan Miller, who is the author of so many great books and resources. He's most well known for 48 Days to the Life and Work and Life that you love. He just put that out again. And back in December of 2023, just a few 6, 7, 8 weeks ago, Dan came to our mastermind and shared with us that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And it was a shock to all of us. Dan seemed to be very healthy. He worked on his health. He was just so much light that he gave into the world. And in that diagnosis, he was told that he had a very, very short time to be on this earth. And we worked through that reality together as a mastermind in a community. There's between 22, 25 of us in that high-level mastermind with Dan. And we began to process it together. And Dan's health went down very, very quickly. And as I was planning this event that I was to attend in January with the mastermind, we knew as the event got closer and closer that it was probably going to be that we may not even be able to see Dan as his health was declining so rapidly. And that's exactly how things played out. We came together as a mastermind. All of us were there, but due to Dan's health, we were not able to see him in person. We had spoken with him by our mastermind Zoom call just a couple of weeks before that, but we were not able to see him in person. We were able to be with his wonderful, beautiful wife, Joanne. We were able to be with his 3 adult kids and spend some time with them, but we were not able to be with Dan. But we were able to be together. And Dan did pass just on the Sunday, January 21st, right after we were there. Our event was on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Dan actually passed on that Sunday evening. Almost 48 days. In fact, it might have been exactly 48 days from the time of his diagnosis. So one of the words, when we got together as a mastermind, I had the privilege of leading our group on Friday in using one of the tools that we have here at the process, the One Life Maps. And one of the exercises that we did was I had everyone go around the room and share one word that would describe Dan and the impact that he's made. And then the next day, we all got together in probably one of the most special experiences I've ever had with a community of people to share together for about 2.5 hours the impact that Dan Miller had had on our life. He not only wanted us, he had asked us, come together at this mastermind. I don't want to hear about all the great things I've done, but I want to hear about the legacy that you'll carry forward. And that is just something that for the last 6 weeks that Dan was on this earth, he just kept saying, I want to hear about the legacy that you will carry forward. And so the quote, the word, the phrase that came to me was this idea that Dan was such a beautiful companion. So let me start the story and kind of give you the backstory of why the word companion. I remember when I attended actually a conference, Social Media Marketing World, back in 2018. And I had just started kind of this entrepreneurial journey as a coach and as a speaker and a podcaster. I think podcasting was still about a year out before I started this podcast, but I'd been working since about 2016. I still wasn't quite sure what I was building or why I was building it, but I knew I was called to create something that would be life-changing work, not only for myself, but for others. And I had started to put together this framework of the real life process, like doing life differently from a rule of life approach. And the framework was starting to come together. I had used it in my coaching practice for about 6 to 9 months, and things were moving along. I'd become certified as a coach. I'd completed some spiritual direction training, which was really important to me. And I was just exploring lots of options. I was leading some workshops, doing some speaking. And the clients I was working with were finding value. Now, back up again in the story about 6 months earlier, if you've been listening to the podcast for very long, you know some of the backstory of what was going on in my life in 2016, 2017. We had just recently lost our son to drug addiction at the age of 30. It was a 10-year battle that we had walked with him. And at the end of that battle was when I was kind of launching out into this business. And so I come to this conference at Social Media Marketing World in 2018, still deep in grief. It's only been about 6 months since our son Eric had passed away. And I truly didn't recognize all that was going on. I knew that I needed community. I knew that I needed to be around positive people. And it's crazy that I even chose to go to that conference, but all I knew was to just move forward and do the next right thing. So I'd been invited to that conference by a group of online friends. I had actually found Dan Miller through a mutual friend that I had been doing some coach training with. And I had started to follow him, and I had gone on an actual, Farmer Dale and I had gone on a cruise with Dan. And so I had gotten to know him a little bit, and I had joined this online group that he had called the Eagles Community. So a lot of people were going to this conference, so I decided to go as well. They'd been really supportive of me. They'd helped me hold this group and encouraged me as I felt called to do the work that I was doing. And Dan Miller was the mentor of this group. I had grown to admire him so much. I had watched not only his wisdom, but his generosity and his leadership skills. And he seemed to be a companion to so many that were on the journey. And I just began to follow the things that he said and the things that he did. And I show up at Social Media Marketing World that year and, working on my business and growing it. And Dan was there. And I knew some of the people that he knew from afar. Even though I'd been on the cruise with him, I kind of just admired him from afar, as we often do. And I noticed that when he spoke, people listened. And that when he gathered at a table, others gathered. But we truly, him and I, had not had many one-to-one conversations. He was so far ahead of me on the journey, but yet he made you feel like he was right there with you as a companion. And he was willing to share that journey and come alongside you. I could also tell that he was a man of faith and that faith was important to him. So one day we're at Social Media Marketing World and he invites me to lunch. He said, I'd like to have lunch with you today and kind of have a one-to-one conversation with me. And he began during that conversation to ask me questions about my family and my faith and my son and my daughter and our farm, which was something that Dan and I always had in common. Dan grew up Amish and he grew up on a farm. And so we could always talk farming, and he understood the work ethic and what farming was. But he wanted to know my vision for the future. And what was so beautiful about that conversation, I'll never forget it. He was more interested in me as a person than the business that I was doing. I remember how much he connected to my story in so many ways, and how he shared his story of him and Joanne's journey. And I really felt like he knew me. After we left that event, I was honored and privileged that Dan invited me to be a part of his inner community of about 20 or 25 people in his mastermind. People that were doing life and business together. I remember crying tears as I was invited in, and he asked me, why the tears? And I said, I had prayed for the last 3 years and had longed for a new community. You see, in my past, maybe kind of like you have. I'd been connected to other communities, but I'd lost them along the way. Part of that was even my journey as a pastor in a church when I stepped away from that role and came home to help my husband on the farm as Eric was struggling. I lost that community. So I was just dying inside for community. And here was this amazing guy inviting me in. So those were definitely tears of joy. And I remember feeling like I was coming into a place where even though people were at different levels and different places in their journey, that we were all companioning together. And so this invitation by my mentor, Dan Miller, the invitation he gave me that day was life-changing in ways that words could never explain, because I now had a place to belong. So from 2018 until now, currently, that has been my place to belong, and has deepened my understanding and value of community as a place to do life together in a trusted circle with friends that have common values. And this is something that I feel like Dan has spoken into me, is he has modeled for me and set up this way that I can carry on the legacy of that type of work, of doing life together in community. Now, my ideal way that I would do life together in community is always around a good cup of coffee, maybe some dark chocolate, being in, the living room, or at a great coffee shop. But because we're not able to do that, technology gives us the ability to do it across the globe through online community. And that's something else that Dan modeled for us. We met each and every week in community. We met 3 times a year in person. And as I look back on my business growth, I can trace so much of the growth and the connections I've had to the community that Dan Miller built, the community that he invited me into. So when Dan passed just a few weeks ago now, it's been a couple of weeks as I'm recording this episode. I was still in Florida when he passed. I was still there with my husband, Dale. And as we gathered and celebrated his life and legacy, and we were together with friends on that Saturday morning to hold space for not only our grief, but our laughter and our tears, I once again kind of experienced that deep value of community and companionship. And even though the mastermind is carrying on and we're meeting over Zoom again, I just feel this deep sense of gratitude of what Dan modeled for me. And it reminds me of this quote, and I shared this on that Saturday. And this quote is from Wayne Mueller. And it says this. It says, "We're called to be strong companions and clear mirrors to one another, to seek those who reflect with compassion and a keen eye how we are doing, whether we seem centered or off course. We need the nourishing company of others to create the circle needed for growth, freedom, and healing." I love so many things about that quote and so many things that I saw modeled in my mentor, Dan Miller. He was such a strong companion, but yet he would sit in this mastermind with us, and you felt like he was just one of you. He never took the limelight or the stage. He never said, this is the way I would do it. He was just always so open to learn and to grow right alongside with you. But yet, he would reflect back to you where he could see growth in you, or he would call you to growth. He would call you to do the work, the healing work that you needed to do. And he was always doing it himself. He was a companion to me and to countless others. He modeled companionship so well as he journeyed on this earth. I just recently talked with Dan back in probably August or September, maybe even October, about my vision for this idea of building community and how it was such a value for me. And he encouraged me to go there, as he always did. I watched him have such a thriving community. So the greatest legacy that I can do, the greatest legacy that I can carry forward is my passion for building life-giving relationships through community, through being a companion. And I hope that I model that. I know I will think of Dan often as I connect with others, to not be ahead of them, to give wisdom rather than advice, to walk alongside is the idea and the picture that I have of companionship. And I always felt that when I was with Dan, when I was in Dan and Joanne's home that was so welcoming. When I would get on one-to-one calls with him, I was honored that Dan wrote the foreword for my book, Doing What Matters, Live from Rest, Not Rush, which is where this podcast comes from. And I have so many amazing times that companionship was there through Dan. And that is the legacy that I hope to carry forward. I hope that I can connect with you as a listener of this podcast and companion you in some way, shape, or form. And that can look so different in so many ways. We have so many ways that we could companion and do life together, you and I. So I hope that you'll look at those ways. One of them is in our circle community, this new community that we've just launched. And you can come along and come into that community. Just go to therrealifeprocess.com and /join. And you can join that community and get logged in and be a part of it. It's absolutely free. So it's therrealifeprocess.com /join to come into that community. Make sure you send me a direct message when you do. And don't forget to go download the free resource of needs and values. Again, therrealifeprocess.com /needs and values. Because one of the values that I have, one of my top values is impact. And I know that Dan wanted nothing more than for those that he spoke life-giving words into and companioned to make an impact. So I look at that word impact now, and I think of Dan. And I think of the impact that he made on my life and the impact that God is calling me to make in the lives of others, whether it be small or huge impact. I don't know. I just take it one relationship at a time, one conversation at a time. But download that free resource. Look at those values that you have, especially. You can look at the needs as well, but look at the values you have especially and see how do those values become a part of the legacy that you carry forward. So thank you for listening today. I really wanted to share the story with you of the impact that Dan had had on my life. And maybe somebody comes to mind that has just been just as impactful in your life. And maybe you want to send them a note or send them a letter and let them know how impactful they were. We had the opportunity on that call that Dan shared with us his diagnosis. We had the opportunity that day to go around the room and share that impact. We had the opportunity to sit with his family the Saturday before Dan passed and share with his kids the impact and the legacy. One of the most impactful moments, one of the most amazing moments I've ever had. So don't wait to say those things to those people that have impacted you and that have poured into your life and have been a companion. So thank you for listening in today to my story. These were some extraordinary days. I have a couple of other things that I'll share with you in some upcoming episodes about the 16-day period here at the beginning of 2024. This is just one of the stories. I have a couple of more that I look forward to sharing. And remember that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. Let's you and I connect again next week.